Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Let's see here. We're just getting started. I see participants joining now. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to our panelists today and to all the attendees who are online with us on Zoom, and then also watching via Facebook Live. My name is Nils Andreasen. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Municipal League and co-hosting this series focused on state revenue options and the state's fiscal condition with AARP. Really glad to be partnering to really work to understand where Alaska's at, where Alaska's headed, and how legislators and others might be thinking about the path ahead. And I know for the Alaska Municipal League, it's in, for local governments, we're so connected to the stability, the health of the state, that revenue, having a state that can afford its services, having a state that isn't focused on shifting costs to local governments, and that's important to us. And so when we're thinking about today's budget and potential revenue options, we're really thinking about how do we ensure that state and local governments have what they need to work together to deliver things for all Alaskans. I'll turn it over to Marge to talk a little bit about this partnership and AARP more generally and in regards to this topic. Marge?
Thank you, Nils. So welcome, everyone. I'm Marge Stone-King, Advocacy Director for AARP Alaska. And AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan member organization with over 75,000 members in Alaska, dedicated to empowering Alaskans 50 and older to choose how and where they live as they age. And we know that Alaska has the fastest growing senior population in the country and that most of us want to stay here as we age. And that's good for Alaska. With older Alaskans being very civically engaged, having a higher voting turnout than any other age group, and having higher rates of volunteering and charitable giving, in addition to accounting for more than half of consumer spending. Older Alaskans are good for Alaska. And the work of the Alaska legislature is critical to ensuring that older Alaskans can age here safely and affordably. This issue was brought up to me when I first started with AARP back in December by a number of our volunteers and members as being of concern to their ability to stay in Alaska and to their overall well-being. So we followed it up with a member survey overall, and when we surveyed our members on state fiscal solutions earlier this year, there was strong agreement, regardless of geography or party affiliation, in opposition to continued state budget cuts and in support of revenue solutions. So that's why we're here co-hosting this series with Alaska Municipal League. We both of our agencies have a stake in Alaskans being able to stay in Alaska in their communities. Our research shows that older Alaskans are keenly aware of the state fiscal challenges and very concerned about it. And they're willing to do their part to ensure a sustainable Alaska for future generations by supporting a broad-based tax as part of a comprehensive fiscal solution. So most relevant to our conversation today, a state sales tax of 3%, which is the question that we posed in the survey, to help balance the budget and maintain state services, was strongly supported initially across all demographics by 2/3 of our respondents. However, when participants were informed that a combined state and local sales tax for some communities could be as high as 10%, support for a state sales tax dropped to just below majority at 48%. So that's where we're coming into this conversation, but we are supportive, the devil's in the details, and we are supportive of a fiscal solution that includes a broad-based tax and gets us to where we need to be as a state to be sustainable and keep Alaskan pioneers in Alaska. Thank you, Nils.
Yeah, thank you, Marge. I'm glad that you brought that data into it. I know that AARP and AML are pulling together towards Alaska's future, where Alaskans of all generations can stay in Alaska. And we know that the state's budget shortfall must be addressed, that new revenues are needed, and we want to make sure that all Alaskans can remain in their communities as they age and have what they need to do so. This is a 5-part series of conversations for those of you who are just joining the series. We started with an overview of the state's fiscal condition. We've talked about other taxes and revenues, including how to think about the PFD. We've talked about oil taxes. This series today will be focused on sales taxes, and next week, income taxes. And none of them are focused on, it's not a technical presentation, it's not pro or even con in relation to these revenues. It's really trying to get a sense of where is the legislature at in thinking about these issues. And Representative, normally I would and should defer to my mayor on the call, but I know we talked earlier. House Ways and Means has been very active throughout this, especially this special session. Can you kind of give us a short introduction of what that looks like and kind of what the dialogue there has been around new revenues generally?
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks so much to AARP and AML for hosting today's forum, and in particular this series of forums on fiscal policy in our state's fiscal situation. I think there are a few things I'm more passionate about because than getting to a fiscal plan, because so many other decisions, policy discussions we can have about meaningful things are really all sort of driven by whether or not we have the funds to be able to do what we need. And we also understand that there's a lot of impact on our state of not resolving our fiscal situation. We've seen sort of the trickle down impact to local governments, as was referenced by Nils, through a series of budget cuts over the years. And we've lost about 50,000 people in net out migration over the last 8 years. We've always had high migration in and out of the state, but what has changed in the last 8 years is, while we've had about the same amount of people leaving, we've had fewer people coming. It used to be that Alaska was viewed as a land of opportunity, and it's just not seen that way, sadly, for a lot of folks. And top of mind for me is making sure that those of us who are lifelong Alaskans who are committed to being here, come what may, can count on the fiscal stability of our state to provide for the public education, health, and safety of Alaskans moving forward. So, passing a fiscal plan is the single most important thing that we can do. You asked me to talk a little bit about the House Ways and Means Committee that I chair. This is a special committee that was created to look at ways that we could squeeze more value from our resources, limit the growth of government, and find revenue in order to balance the budget. It has a threefold goal, and we've looked at all three of those pieces, but I think I'm going to focus specifically in on some of the recent work that we've done after we heard from the bipartisan bicameral fiscal policy working group on elements of a comprehensive fiscal plan. And I will put a link to that in the chat after I'm done speaking so that everybody can see what is actually in that report. But essentially, the fiscal policy working group that represented sort of the most conservative and the most liberal, members of the legislature came together and agreed on elements of a comprehensive plan that would include modernizing the dividend formula, constitutionally protecting the percent of market value spending cap from the permanent fund, and also constitutionally protecting the dividend, spending cap reform, additional modest cuts working towards reductions of $25 to $200 million over multiple years, and revenue in the range of $507 to $775 million to balance the budget. And I think this was really remarkable work in a lot of respects. Thanks to the Fiscal Policy Working Group, we've agreed on the size of the problem and the elements of a solution, which is massive progress over just 8 months ago when the legislature gavelled in. I know that the public feels a little frustrated that we're sort of in Groundhog Day when it comes to addressing our state's fiscal situation, and I share that frustration. But what happens every 2 years is that in the legislature, you know, a good portion of the legislature turns over every 2 years. And so you have to start by re-establishing what the facts are and what the boundaries of the negotiations are. So the Ways and Means Committee has been looking at all 3 elements of our charge, but has heard specific proposals for a fiscal plan from members of both sides of the aisle that include a 2.5% flat tax, proposals to update Alaska's spending cap, a sales tax, oil tax updates, and then permanent fund reforms that include constitutionalizing the POMV and the dividend, and updating a 39-year-old dividend formula that really needs modernization. And I think that we've seen some real leadership, some political courage in introducing these proposals. I think the governor was a little inaccurate when he said the other day that there were no proposed solutions in front of the legislature right now. There are, in fact, lots of proposed solutions in front of the legislature. I'd like to say that all the pieces are on the chessboard right now. Now we just need to figure out what our moves are going to be and come to a compromise in the middle. And so some element of some combination of these proposals is likely to be a part of a grand bargain. And I think that we're much closer than many are aware. For example, the legislature's nonpartisan fiscal analyst projects that an update to the dividend formula to split the POMV draw from the permanent fund, with 75% going to essential government services like public education, safety and road maintenance, and 25% for dividends would produce a $1,250 dividend in FY23 and grow from there. And that is actually an increase in a dividend over what we just passed in the legislature this special session. It would also reduce projected deficits by 4/5, about $800 million from the governor's proposed fiscal plan. And so I think that signals that we could be much closer to a solution than many might think. I personally have proposed a comprehensive fiscal plan based on, build on the 75-25 split that would balance the budget with only modest revenue to balance the budget and put our state on such sound financial footing that we could begin to chip away at our deferred maintenance backlog that I know that the members of the Alaska Municipal League are keenly concerned about, and also make strategic investment in bipartisan initiatives that include, a universal optional pre-kindergarten. We also know that Representative Adam Wohl and Representative Garantar have both proposed comprehensive fiscal plans to balance the budget. So, the coverage of the dividend issue that a lot of Alaskans have been seeing in the news recently may make it appear that we've made no progress in creating fiscal stability for our state, but we have actually made some real progress. And there's 2 other points that I want to make about the progress that we've made. And that is, over the last 4 years, we've cut the budget dramatically. In fact, since FY13, we've cut the budget by $3 billion. And then in SB 26 in 2018, we reduced our state's fiscal gap by 2/3. That's remarkable progress. It's created some great fiscal stability for our state, which I think is really commendable. Now we're sort of in the final stretch, and sometimes it seems darkest before the dawn, but we're actually very close to a permanent resolution to our state's fiscal instability. And the way forward is there to pass a sustainable fiscal plan. All of the pieces have been proposed, and now what we need is leadership, courage, and a willingness to compromise. And I think, Senator Micciche and I have both been advocates for fiscal resolution, as have been many members of the legislature. Now, if we can get the governor to the table to start negotiating, we can resolve our fiscal situation and give Alaskans the fiscal certainty they deserve.
Thanks so much, Representative. And I do want to come back to sales tax specifically, but Senator, as Senate President, I know, well, last time AML met in Juneau, you talked about fiscal policy, and that must be almost 2 years ago at this point. But we've talked about a comprehensive fiscal plan. The Senate has worked toward that just as hard, I know, as the House. Where's the Senate at right now, and the state more broadly? How are you feeling about where we're headed?
Well, I warned Representative Spohnholz about my lead-in because the way I wanted to start off is that I'm very disappointed that you have a Democrat that doesn't agree with every single thing that I propose as my panelist opponent. So I'm going to call her an opponent because we can't get things solved until everyone agrees with what I want to do. The reason I'm bringing that up is because that still happens to be the attitude with some in the legislature, and they just have to move off of that position. The example I've given this group, I want to thank AARP and AML for having this forum online today, but I'm married. And I can get my way every time from my wife. I can get everything I want every time. And at some point, I'm going to be sending a check to the place where I used to live to support my former wife and current children as I send it from a damp apartment somewhere else, right? I mean, it's just, legislators have a very difficult time building relationships on these issues and being able to get off of their current position and realize that the answer is going to be somewhere in between. So obviously I like Representative Spohnholz very much and respect her. I think she covered it very well. The primary issue, and I've discussed with this group, is how do you settle the PFD issue that satisfies 51+% of the people of Alaska so that we can get on to the other things. And comprehensive fiscal plan is the answer. I am extremely impressed with the outcome of the bipartisan fiscal policy working group. And why is that? Primarily because we chose 8 people who are diametrically opposed on almost everything, who worked together for 8 weeks or so, and they put a menu of options together that proves that even a group that diverse can find a way to solve this problem. Now, we do have a small group of longer-term sort of status quo legislators that like the annual fight, that are not as sort of concerned about solving this problem. I think that group is shrinking. I think the group of those willing to solve this problem has grown. And I don't know if folks noticed that we put Senate Bill 53 purposely on the floor to illustrate where people stand on solving this problem. It was the last night of the special session. We ended up tabling the bill. We tabled the bill because it had no chance in passing. It had no chance in passing because there were probably 5 votes for any of the solution you could have put on the table. We still have somewhat of a distance to go, but I think the representative pointed out well the things that have to happen. We have to decide on an appropriate PFD, how to fill that gap, decide if what fills that gap is low, broad, and temporary or part of a longer-term solution, revenue-wise. The spending limit is important because of the math of the fund versus spending, right? We have slowed the growth of government. If we could limit the growth of government to somewhere around Anchorage CPI, 2% averaged over 3 or 5 years, that's the approximate amount we've seen the last few years. The permanent fund grows much faster than that, right? Since inception, I think it's 8.9%. We had a phenomenal year this year. Callan says the number is 6.5%, but that fund grows much faster than spending, which is why I use the low, broad, and temporary. If that's what it takes to get revenue passed, we can get there. At risk of not solving the problem is exacerbating the capacity of the legislature by replacing very capable legislators with one-issue legislators that are sometimes less likely to solve the problem and more focused on a larger PFD. So I think we have had some success. I think the representative is correct that that we've moved a long way from when I came into office in 2013. I think most legislators want to solve this problem, and I think people are ready to roll up their sleeves. There are a few individuals that I think we have to push past to get there, and that's okay. That's just generally there are folks that are more hesitant to do things differently than we have in the past. But the risk is we can solve this in the next year or so and put Alaska on a path to a very bright future, or we can continue this downward spiral. And I think you probably have a decade before things move toward improvement. And I'm not willing to do the latter. We need to push our members to kind of open up their minds, find that magic combination of things that make everyone equally unhappy. So that we actually could have a plan on the table that not only provides state services, a fair PFD, and a comprehensive fiscal plan moving forward, but one that tells potential investors, people that may be looking at Alaska for a place to do business, that we have taken care of this issue and that it's a safe place to invest to help us grow this infant state into the greatness that we've been destined for. We've had the brakes on for about 7 years now, and there's so much opportunity cost that has been lost as we fumble around with the solution. It's time to get it done, and I'm going to kind of leave it at that and see what kind of questions come in, but I'm excited to hear what seniors, me being one of them now, I didn't know it was 50 plus, so I'm in your group. And I'm kind of here to excited to hear what kind of questions come forward.
Great, thank you, Senator. Before we, there's a couple of kind of specific technical questions about sales tax, but can you, I guess, Representative, maybe we'll start with you. I know we heard a sales tax bill this session, which is new and different to some extent. How should we be thinking about a state sales tax? And we broadly, you specifically, the legislature, what are the considerations involved in thinking about, is this a good solution or not?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that, you know, sales taxes, 45 other states already have sales taxes, and so they are pretty common. We also have a situation where 108 communities in the state of Alaska have local sales taxes. So I think, you know, there are sort of two different ways that are really important to think about sales taxes. One is from a policy standpoint, and the other one is from a politics standpoint, like, can it actually get done? And I'm going to start with policy. I think that, you know, a sales tax has a few upsides. It would tax the 2 million tourists that we have in a typical tourism year, a non-COVID tourism year. It would also tax the 20% of Alaska's workforce who are non-residents, although I will point out so would an income tax, because all of those folks would be able to pay an income tax as well. There are some challenges with sales tax from my standpoint. One is that they're very regressive. You know, poor people spend more of their income every month. Poor people spend all of their income every month. And so they would spend a larger percentage of their income on a sales tax than would wealthier people. Sales taxes are often in other jurisdictions capped at a certain amount, which means if you buy a used Subaru, you're likely to pay the same amount of tax as somebody who buys a brand new Hummer. And from my perspective, you know, that's a real problem. I think of Alaska as a big family, and I want people that have a little bit more to be able to pay a little bit more, and people that have a little bit less to pay a little bit less. It's that way in my family. There was a time when I was young when my mom bought dinner when we went out, and now that she's retired and my husband and I are, you know, at our peak earning potential, we buy dinner. And I sort of feel that Alaskans are a family, and we should distribute responsibility for paying for services in that way. The other issue, as I mentioned, is that there are local jurisdictions all across the state that already have sales taxes, and many of them are in rural Alaska where things already cost more. And so there are some problems from a policy lens for me when it comes to a sales tax. There are some ways to mitigate some of these issues. If you want to try to mitigate regressivity, you can do what the city of and Borough of Juneau has done, and they have uncapped their sales tax. They said, if you're buying a diamond ring, you're going to pay more sales taxes than it is somebody who is just getting the cheap gold band when they get married, right? And so people can contribute more according to their means. It's been really good for the city of Juneau when people come through town, tourists come through town, and they make large investments on art or jewelry or other things like this. They contribute meaningfully. You can have exemptions for items needed for daily living so that you can make sure that, you know, food is excluded, feminine products are excluded, prescriptions and healthcare are excluded. Another way to make it less regressive is to make it a sales and use tax so that you're also taxing services. People that are higher income tend to spend more of their money on services. Poor people spend less money on accountants and attorneys. And so if you also tax those kinds of services, it makes it less regressive. A way to address some of the issues with regard to the impacts on local jurisdictions. We have communities in Alaska that have sales taxes as large as 7%. And what you don't want to do is to layer in another, statewide sales tax on top of that very high sales tax that is used to pay for things like schools and road maintenance in rural Alaska, for example. And instead, what you could do is you could cap the amount of sales tax that is allowed at all. We do that with petroleum property taxes in the state of Alaska. We could say combined state and local sales taxes shouldn't exceed 7% in the state of Alaska, or shouldn't exceed 7.27%, which is the national average for sales taxes. So there are some ways that you can sort of mitigate some of the problems with a sales tax. It's not my preferred option. I really believe, given the regressivity of a sales tax and the hyper regressivity of a PFD reduction, you need to have an offset of a more progressive income stream to create some equity sort of across the board. And that's the reason that I personally am more supportive of an income tax as a complement to a dividend formula rewrite. So those are the policy considerations from my perspective. The other question is the politics. Can you actually get to 21 members in the House and 11 in the Senate? And I think that's a real question. And I think that it's unlikely unless the governor decides to really get proactively involved in working on a fiscal plan and in brokering a solution. My concern is that we're not likely to pass what I would characterize as a more progressive sales tax, something like what Juneau has structured with some of the policy elements that I've just discussed with the current makeup of the legislature. And so, at this point in time, I'm very, very reluctant to support a sales tax for those reasons. I'd love to hear what Peter has to say.
Well, thanks, Representative. Senator, you've experienced implementing a sales tax at the local level, so I imagine you bring that experience up as well. But how do you think about a sales tax, and from that policy and politics perspective?
I think the representative covered it well. Again, she doesn't agree with me on everything, which is why I still don't like her. So I did. I was the mayor of Soldotna for years, and we had relatively high property taxes, and realized that there's this thing called dip netting and tourist season, and we had our own residents paying for all the services that these folks would come enjoy for free. And we sort of translated that into a sales tax. While I was mayor, we cut property taxes 3 times until the city of Soldotna had a lower property tax than the unincorporated borough areas surrounding Soldotna. We had parks and libraries and a police force and all of those great services, and we had a lower property tax. It's worked very well. I left the city with a very healthy fund balance. That fund balance remains. So there are some benefits to a sales tax. I understand the regressivity. The problem that we have, it comes back to a PFD thing, right? So we live in this amazing state. Just think if I were able to be the Senate president in Ohio, and at the end of the session, I was able to go and give a message where I said, okay, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is we have eliminated all broad-based taxes in the state. There's no longer an income and a sales tax. The bad news is I can only send you $1,100 of cash apiece. If I were to make that announcement in Ohio, I would be the president forever of Ohio. I would be the most popular human being in Ohio, right? I'm not Senate president in Ohio. We have this unique thing called the permanent fund dividend, and that brings us back. If it weren't for the PFD and solving that issue, we would have no need for broad-based revenue at this time. That $1,100 would fill the gap, and we would be in a very good position that would be improving over time. Again, earlier, remember, because the permanent fund, which now supplies the lion's share of our revenue, the POMV would be growing faster than spending would. So then let's talk about the issues with the sales tax. I prefer sales tax, and one of the reasons for that, although I fundamentally have, we have a difficult state with a relatively low proportion compared to other states of those that are working, partially because of the economy in rural Alaska and other parts of the state. But I believe, I've talked about an all-in plan. I believe if we're going to pay out a PFD, that folks should be somewhat responsible for helping to fund the government so that that PFD can be the size that it ends up being when we solve this fiscal issue. The other reason is the fact that I don't believe an income tax is going to pass. When you look at the makeup of the legislature and the governor, who has said he does not support an income tax, I think it'd be very difficult to get it passed. So with those constraints in mind, how can we get something passed that's going to cover what is likely a temporary gap, fiscal gap, so that we can have a long-term comprehensive fiscal plan? And I think the most likely candidate to pass the legislature is a sales tax. There are a lot of ways that we can control the regressivity of that. The representative covered that very well. But I do want to point out the fact that, just took my second daughter, my 15-year-old, for some surgery at Seattle Children's Hospital, and didn't think anything about their essentially 10% sales tax that funds that state. A lot of states are in that range. I think there are ways that you can control that. In our area, it's 3% borough, 3% city for a 6% total. If people adapt to that 3% additional for some time, if they knew that it was low, broad, and temporary, even bringing up all the problems with the regressivity, if we knew that it got us to where we needed to go, I believe people would adjust if it's the only viable option that's likely to pass the legislature right now. And as it goes through the system, we're going to have all those discussions about exemptions and caps and all of the things that are a part of tax policy. But I do invite those that are watching today to go to the Tax Foundation, largely nonpartisan group that kind of just shares tax facts from around the country and see what others are living under. We're the only state without a broad-based tax of some kind. Look at what others are paying and consider how blessed we've been without any broad-based tax since, well, most of my life, 40 something years. And think about the fact that if that does get us to the next level and get this solved, if we can work together on what a broad-based impact could look like at this time, especially if industry is picking up a piece of it, government is picking up a piece of it with thoughtful cuts over time. And we're kind of all in on a solution that gets us out of this mud, very sticky mud that has kept us from moving forward for the last 7 years. And I think folks could say a decade, but really we've been most focused on the issue since we burned through the CBR. There's not another savings account. Now is the time. So I'm willing to compromise a little bit to get us there. I think most legislators are. I think most of the leadership teams are willing to, or most members of the two leadership teams are willing to compromise. I think the governor needs to engage with some policy that is led by the governor that is more in sync with the way the legislature is moving, has a greater chance of passing. And I think we can get there. I think his original plan of the bridge funding to a 50-50 has proven to not be supported by the legislature. So let's look at these other options very seriously. Let's get some legislation on the table. Let's have some very open conversations. I frankly don't mind putting things on the floor. Folks don't always focus on the committee work. I think the committees can polish the governor's legislation, our own legislation, but I don't mind having the conversation on the floor like we did at 53. Let Alaskans hear kind of where people are, and some legislators think that's dangerous. We still have two bodies that it has to go through. I think what the Senate's willing to pass, the House is going to adjust, and we meet in conference and see what can get across the finish line. But we really do need the push from constituents to get this done. I think people are frustrated. I know we're frustrated. I just put this on. I took a shower because last night, my first job after getting home at 10 o'clock was to fix the leaky clothes washer hose that has been a problem for quite some time. I had a long list of things to catch up on. We've been gone for 7 months. I have 4 kids. It's, my dog didn't even recognize me. It's frustrating. We'd like to get these things done. And I'm not whining about how long the work is taking, but I can tell you if individual legislators are frustrated at the lack of progress, the people of Alaska are equally frustrated. So we need that kind of pressure. We need folks to call their legislators and say, I'm willing to see a plan. I may not agree with every piece of it, but it's time that we have it on the table. It's time that we get something across the finish line and we move to the next level. One thing I realized about legislation, it's never perfect, and that's okay. Let's get something that we make sure we don't let the perfect get in the way of the good, and we adjust along the way so we move to the next step.
Great, thank you, Senator. Marge, I'll turn to you. Any questions that you're seeing from our various, either online or in the Q&A box?
So we do have a few questions in, but before I get to them, I'll just tell folks, if you do have a question and you're on the Zoom webinar, put it in the Q&A box. And if you're on the live feed on Facebook, go ahead and put it in the comments. So I think we'll start this question with Rep. Spohnholz on the topic of the governor, because the senator brought that up most recently. In your committee, well, publicly, the governor has said different things about broad-based taxes. Yes, no, has to be approved by a vote of the people, et cetera. And I know that came up recently in your committee. Can you speak to your current understanding of where that is and the importance of that?
Well, I think the governor's position, I mean, he is moved a little bit on this, which I think is great. I think at the beginning of the year, he was, stridently committed to constitutional amendments that would have made it very difficult for us to solve our problem. And so I think that he's moved back a little bit. The call on the fourth special session is basically elements needed to solve our fiscal situation, which that's broad enough that we can actually put together a package that could get 21 and 11, and hypothetically the 2/3 that we need, at least for a constitutional amendment, protecting the permanent fund, which I think we understand that would be that's the ideal scenario is that we also constitutionally protect that permanent fund. Moving it into a single endowment fund and providing some certainty for the people of Alaska that there be a dividend. I think that what we're still waiting for, and I'm hearing inklings that the governor may be getting more robustly involved in special session number 4, is the governor taking some ownership and some leadership. We had expected in the 3rd special session that the administration was going to introduce some revenue proposals. They ended up not doing that. For me, that was a disappointment, because we have an obligation to pass a balanced budget in the state of Alaska. And originally the proposal to constitutionally, to constitutionalize a 50-50 split of the POMV and not have any new revenues meant that we would be then forced to initiate massive cuts to the budget. And we're talking about cuts to the budget in the range of $1.2 billion to a $500 million, sort of moving forward. The governor's 50-50 split, for example, in FY23 would create a $1.2 billion deficit. And as the permanent fund continues to grow, assuming, a rosy future, which means that oil continues to stay either flat or grows moving forward, and that we are able to realize the 6.2% earnings that Callan is projecting for the permanent fund, that deficit would go down to about $500 million by about FY27 or FY28. So there's a huge gap that we need to bridge in the meantime. And Senator Micciche referenced the bridge funding proposal that the governor had. Essentially, what that would have been was taking 200% or 2 times the sustainable draw from the permanent fund in order to avoid passing revenue measures. And that would have forced us to increase taxes or reduce spending by another $150 million a year, every year in the future, because the permanent fund is projected to earn 6.25% in income, and we've got a spending cap that says we're not going to take more than 5% from the permanent fund each year. And that 5% on the $3 billion is roughly $150 million. So that was a non-starter, but we really, we're going to need the governor to identify what success looks for him. If he wants a 50-50 split, I can get there if there's the revenue to balance that. What I'm not willing to do is to start, further massive cuts to the budget that would roll downhill and cause problems for local jurisdictions all across the state of Alaska who are trying to provide public safety, who are trying to provide public education, and would essentially result in massive tax increases at local jurisdictions all across the state of Alaska. So I think that there's an opportunity here. I think the governor has signaled a willingness to compromise. He's already made some compromises. That's fantastic. I think the legislature is going to have to make some compromises too moving forward. It might be that our preferred revenue options don't get advanced. It might be that there is an update to the statutory spending cap so that we can, give the people of Alaska comfort that if new revenue measures pass, we're not going to see a surge in government spending as a result of that. I think that those are fair compromises and discussions that we can have moving forward.
Thank you, Rep. Spohnholz. And Senator, what's your take on where the governor's at on broad-based taxes in this conversation?
I've seen some I mean, here a really good example of him realizing if any of his objectives are going to be met, that he has to work with the legislature was signing the PFD. Right? He had the stand that the money was not in the SPR. The 1100 was not enough for him. He had a goal of a much higher 50-50 this year. I supported that, but what passed was 1100 twice. And the court ruling proved that the first 1100 was there, but he made the statement that there was no money left in the SPR, and he chose to sign the bill. So he voted the same way I did, same way the representative did, to send out an $1,100 PFD right now. And I think the reason for that is that we all realized that there was a risk that there would be a $0 PFD. And I know rural communities can't afford that. Many seniors can't afford that. Many families, low-income families, can't afford it. So there's an $1,100 PFD going out. He also has backed off on some of his requirements for a constitutional amendment. So on a constitutional amendment, the more you add to it, the less likely it's going to get the 14 Senate votes and the 21 or 27 House votes in order for it to go to the people. If you have a constitutional amendment that says a PFD will be paid, there's a chance that you get 14 and 27. If there's a constitutional amendment that says a 50-50 permanent fund dividend will be paid, it's much less likely. So all of the things you add in between loses a vote here and there until you don't have enough for that to occur. And that means that the PFD is not secure in the Constitution. I think he wants it secure in the Constitution, so he's realizing that he's going to have to back down on some of his requirements. I've seen the same with the tax having to go before the people. So I think he's coming along. I think he's a good man. I think he definitely has a position, and he told me the other day, he was laughing yesterday morning. Did I come home yesterday? Yesterday morning, I met with him in his office, and he said, I remember when we were sitting on the Senate floor. He sat next to me, and he said, I remember they put me behind that column so that the camera couldn't see me. And he came to me, and one day he turned to me and he said, I said, your only method of operating is like a sledgehammer. It's not effective in this group. You have to get a few votes there, a few votes here in order to get anything across the finish line. And he was laughing about that. I think he still has some of that in him, but I think he's realizing that there's some other tools that maybe work a little better, and they're more effective in getting 21 and 11 and 27 and 14 in order for him to get any part of his objectives met. I think he's coming along, and I hope he's willing to take more leadership on what sort of pieces of legislation might get us there, because he has a part of the legislature that supports him. I don't want to say blindly, because that wouldn't be fair, but they're much more supportive of his policies, and he has a larger portion of the legislature that is more cautious, and he's going to have to realize that both groups are going to have to, he's going to have to lead the folks that are more likely to follow him to join those that are less likely in order for us to get something across the finish line. And I think he's getting there.
Thank you, Senator. So the next question we have from one of our viewers takes us back to the local consideration of a sales tax. And the question is there a plan to adjust the statewide sales tax regionally to even out the total tax across the state? For example, so Anchorage folks can pay 7% sales tax, while folks in Juneau pay 5 plus 2 state, 5 local plus 2 state, and rates in other communities that already have sales taxes would be adjusted similarly. So could you address the local consideration and how that might work, Senator?
Well, I heard the representative talking about that earlier. I actually find that to be problematic on a fairness, statewide fairness basis. When I say low, broad, and temporary, so the latest plan that we're seeing is a stair step to a PFD, to a 50-50 PFD, which means that you need more money earlier on and less as you go forward. I'd rather what you need over a longer term to be sort of targeted for that length of time, which would allow you to have a much lower sales tax than you would need at the beginning. And you would have some sales tax coming in later that you likely didn't need then. That would be sort of on an average would fill that gap. But I personally believe that everyone in the state should be paying the same statewide sales tax. If not, you're going to see some local games on sort of finessing the local tax to be more favorable for the locality and be less focused on the state all-in burden. That's my personal issue with it right now. I think if a community is paying for statewide government services, it should be the same rate. And I'm focused on that sort of 10% or under thing. I think we have to at some point determine what we think is the highest potential statewide sales tax that would complement local communities and not overburden them with something that's going to disadvantage them as far as being competitive with other communities. So I know, and let me clarify what I mean by that. We have a 6% sales tax with a $500 cap for purchase. And people were pushing to eliminate the cap somewhat recently. And when I talked to some assembly members, I said, just think about this. Right now, the way the cap works, if you make that difference higher than $60, it pays for the round trip fuel to Anchorage where there's no sales tax whatsoever. Therefore, your larger ticket items would all be purchased in Anchorage, and it would disadvantage the sales in the local community. And that's part of the policy issue that Rep. Spohnholz discussed. Personally, I think Anchorage needs a sales tax. I think the proportion that local residents are paying in Anchorage when the entire state happens to shop there is a disadvantage to Anchorage residents. If you were to propose a sales tax that was low and broad, then they would likely institute a local sales tax that would help the property owners there and let more people that enjoy the services that Anchorage offer to offset some of that local sales tax or local property tax like we did in Soldotna. So all of those things have to be considered. It's complicated, but those are the kinds of discussions that we need to have in detail before we put something across the finish line in the legislature.
Thank you, Senator. And Representative, I know you addressed this a little earlier in your comments about a cap. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go to the next question and have you start with that one, which is, would the state take over the local tax collection and then pay out to the jurisdictions, or would the vendors, sellers, businesses be filing two separate filings, one local and one state?
Well, currently there's only one formal sales tax proposal in front of the legislature, and that's Representative Garantar's bill. And technically it just died at the end of the third special session, although it could be revived. I know that there are some other proposals that are being drafted and discussed. There is definitely a way to kind of harmonize sales taxes and have them effectively be, implemented by the state and then redistributed throughout the state of Alaska. And I think that that's, something that would make a lot of sense and could potentially offset some of the burdens that have rolled downhill to local jurisdictions across the state as a result of our budget cuts. if we could take off the plate for the 108 communities that already have sales taxes, the responsibility to do the collections and the auditing, I think that would be very helpful. I do want to, just sort of follow up a little bit on the question that you asked Senator Micciche, and that with regard to taxing and how it would work. And I just want to point out that sales taxes in Alaska for a very long time have been the jurisdiction of local communities across the state of Alaska. And I'm very reluctant to layer in a whole nother sales tax on top of what is being paid in some rural communities that have done the right thing, have taken fiscal responsibility for their local communities. They're already taxing their communities. The city of Kodiak has a 7% sales tax, for example. And so, having another statewide sales tax on top of that 7% in Kodiak or in Wrangell strikes me as a really disproportionate impact. And I'll just also point out that things cost a lot more in the state of Alaska, and they especially cost a lot more in rural Alaska. And so, using a Washington state model or a lower 48 model for a sales tax in the state of Alaska doesn't strike me as the most Alaska-centric way to do things. I do agree with the senator that, if you cap the amount of sales tax that is available for taxation in the entire state of Alaska, that you could see some gamesmanship. It might also force the city of Anchorage to adopt a sales tax, which Peter might appreciate. But I think that there are ways to offset some of the revenue issues by uncapping a sales tax, so that it is in fact more fair, and we get more of those revenues than more revenue coming in on big ticket items to pay for the essential government services like teachers, troopers, and transportation that we all really count on for commerce as well as our individual well-being in the state.
I could talk about sales tax for the rest of the day, and I didn't even ask those last two questions. But I am also cognizant of the time and really appreciative of your time, Senator Micciche, Representative Spohnholz. Thanks for everything you're doing. I know this session seems interminable, and I don't know where a fourth session will go, but I know that we'll definitely want to be engaged and as engaged as you are in all this. So thanks again for your time today. Thank you, Marge and AARP and members for your engagement on these issues. Thanks to everybody online for the questions and for paying attention. And we'll see everybody next week. Same time, we'll talk about income taxes or not, or other options. And see where we go. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.